NASA says it's time to prioritize the planet Venus. This follows the recent discovery of possible life on the planet. If you were to take a peek at NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd notice the space agency calling Venus a planet from hell. At the same time, Mars became our destiny. Such careful labeling of the innermost planets isn't a coincidence. During the turbulent space race era, the Soviet Union was fixated on sending costly missions to Venus. The hellish planet showed little to no prospects for life, yet the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the empire. Thanks to Neil deGrasse Tyson, we finally know why. Join us as we break down the declassified photos from Venus taken by the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was dynamic in more ways than one. Not only did it change the geopolitical course of the world, but the loss of the empire also sank many secrets with it. It's not unknown that the Soviets had a deep affinity for secrets. From running the most advanced intelligence agency in the world to being hush-hush about their potential alien contact, the former superpower carries numerous mysteries within itself. Believe it or not, before the United States of America took over most of the planetary efforts in outer space, the Soviet Union was leading the game. While the empire had a long history of successful and unsuccessful space missions, its biggest fixation was on the inner, hellish planet Venus. In the Russian language, you'd recognize Venus as Venera, and hence the subsequent name of the mission that spanned from 1961 to 1983. During the same time, the United States of America was busy sending its missions to the moon. So, strategically, the Soviets decided to use their resources elsewhere. We can't say that the entire obsession with the second planet from our sun is odd. Did the Soviets plan on using the planet's surface as a viable and unbeatable military base? Or were they possibly looking to colonize the planet after searching for any forms of life up there? It's quite difficult to say why the empire was obsessed with the hellish planet. Since the Soviets commissioned these exploration voyages during the Cold War, they weren't exactly forthcoming with their aims and objectives. In fact, everything we know about the Venusian missions is due to unarchived and declassified evidence. Even then, it's hard to pinpoint what the Soviets were searching for and if they cracked the secrets of Venus. The empire didn't land on Venus once, twice, or thrice. That's just elementary, folks. The Soviets launched 28 pricey spacecraft to the hellish planet, and 13 of those entered the Venusian atmosphere, while 8 landed successfully. Such sophisticated missions had put the empire in a leading position in space exploration initiatives. Sure, the United States of America was a close second, but NASA was more interested in satellites and technological configuration than exploring life on other planets. Its affection for Mars came later. So, your history textbook might not tell you this, but the Soviet space program was the first agency to send a probe into the atmosphere of a planet other than Earth. It has another bunch of firsts on its resume as well. The USSR also became the first state to make a soft landing on another planet. It commissioned the first initiative that brought back images and sounds from the surface of another planet. Yep, the Soviets had their own one small step for man, a giant leap for mankind moment, and that was well before the US. So, how come we rarely get to read about such landmark missions? Very rarely. Remember what we said about the Soviet affinity for keeping secrets? Well, that's just one of the many reasons behind the censorship of the Soviet space program. Back in 1992, the popular agency was decommissioned in the aftermath of the USSR, as the agency had to be revived with its new Russian identity, Roscosmos. A lot of its archival data was either lost or destroyed. This is exactly why we don't have a clear-cut answer for why the Soviets launched 208 spacecraft into the Venusian atmosphere. But if we had to make the most logical guess, perhaps the Soviet decision to explore Venus was about cost efficiency more than anything else. This is not to say that the space program wasn't optimistic about the habitability of the planet. They were looking for sustainable water presence, intensity of solar radiation, and the overall temperament of the planet. Without a series of these space missions, it would have been next to impossible to gauge Venus's high temperatures and thick atmosphere. Of course, today, many cosmologists don't believe that the hellish planet can support life. The temperatures up there are high enough to melt lead, and water is scarce. Plus, due to its thick atmosphere, the air pressure on Venus is 90 times that of our planet Earth. But these are quite recent and modern tidings, and to disregard the USSR's contribution to the study of Venus is equivalent to censoring history. As far as the Soviets were concerned, Venus was worth exploring, even if it was just about galvanizing the space race. You see, exploring more habitable planets like Mars wasn't exactly off the table, but it was more costly than probing into Venus. Everything just boils down to the distance from planet Earth to any other cosmological body. On average, the hellish planet is only 40 million kilometers away from our home, while Mars, on average, is 250 million kilometers away. Such vast differences in distance amount to drastic differences in costs as well. If the United States of America wasn't the world's largest economy, it wouldn't have been easy to explore Mars. Other rumors on the block also suggest that the Soviet missions were unreliable and had massive technical gaps. Apparently, the spacecraft wasn't suitable to cover astronomical distances. Plus, the agency had a bad trajectory of losing contact with its spacecraft, so it makes sense why the Soviet space program was opting for a shorter and closer transit that would actually yield results. Yet, if we don't bring up the space race in this context, the story of the Venera missions would be incomplete. The United States of America wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This particular maneuver had intensified the space tussle to maintain its hegemony. But what's really interesting is why the US fixated itself on the moon in the first place. Uncharted territory aside, NASA had a series of failures with its Venus missions in the 1960s and so on. The US Space Agency found itself in a deadlock called the Venus Curse. Every time they launched a probe into the Venusian atmosphere, it went horribly wrong. This is precisely when the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to capitalize on NASA's failures. At that time, both the US and USSR were hell-bent on claiming the space race. The most logical venture was to steer away with two different options. It was a silent agreement. Very strategically, the Soviet space program took hold of Earth's sister planet. For the agency, the biggest landmark in the space tussle was to do something that its competitive counterpart had failed to do. Despite the empire's scarce resources and poorly managed administration, it continuously dispatched missions to Venus to establish its competitive edge against the US. Conversely, NASA had assumed control of the lunar missions. However, this strategic division was not without conflict and propaganda. To mask their significant setbacks with Venus, the American agency was motivated to disparage the USSR's obsession with the planet. In American media, Venus was labeled the infernal planet, whereas Mars was promoted as humanity's destiny. These implications, however, were of little concern to the Soviets. Their primary aim was to demonstrate their superiority over the Americans, and they were indeed successful in this regard. The Venera missions are nearly forgotten in contemporary history. Nonetheless, despite their early origins, these missions were highly sophisticated, advanced, and ambitious. If one were to identify an event that marked the beginning of the space age, the Venera explorations would certainly be at the forefront. In the 1950s, the Soviets began to experiment with the design and construction specifics of the probes. Over the next 30 years, they continued to build and launch interplanetary spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Running parallel to the tumultuous Cold War, the Soviets were fixated on optimizing their resources. Fortunately for them, the early years of the conflict provided them with greater heavy lifting capacity than the United States. This advantage proved to be highly beneficial, allowing them to maximize their capabilities. The USSR started developing and launching larger spacecraft designed to sustain high altitudes and vast distances. The Soviets were quick to experiment with both manned and unmanned spacecraft simultaneously. The Soviet scientific community was engaged in a series of calculations and projections to establish precise trajectories for the Venus missions. Concurrently, their Mars programs were also progressing successfully. For the Soviet Space Agency, nothing was more crucial than developing advanced instrumentation for these probes. This led to a major breakthrough in the field of cosmological studies. In 1966, the Soviet agency launched Venera 3, making it the first artificial probe to penetrate Venus's atmosphere and successfully touch the planet's surface. This monumental achievement intensified the competition between the two superpowers. In contrast to the American missions, which were marked by failures and deadlocks, the Soviet program continued to gain momentum. Despite the program's gradual progress, the USSR was actively striving to send successful probes into the Venusian atmosphere. The primary challenge with this trajectory was limited design capacity. The Soviets quickly overcame their design issues and launched the largest spacecraft of the Venera program in the 1970s. Their enhanced capability enabled them to execute the first dual launches of Venera 4 and Venera 5. According to most historians, this was the most captivating decade in the history of cosmological studies. In fact, the United States did attempt to develop similar launch designs. So, why did the Soviet agency opt for dual launches to Venus in the first place? It's important to understand that interplanetary travel requires advanced instrumentation capable of gathering the highest quality data and evidence. Naturally, the spacecraft was initially sent to monitor the planet's surface. This was precisely the goal with Venera 4. Since the launch proceeded smoothly and the spacecraft successfully entered Venus's atmosphere, the Soviet program continued with Venera 5. This was not merely a replication of the first launch. The second spacecraft was specifically designed to collect unprecedented data about the planet. In other words, the Soviets aimed to uncover details about the temperature, atmospheric pressure, and radiation levels on Venus. They did not have to wait long for their answers. By the early 1970s, the Soviet program was entering the most refined phase of the Venera missions. Up to that point, the USSR's efforts were focused on research and development, ensuring that their designs and constructions were optimized. It was also about perfecting the techniques and mechanics for interplanetary travel. By the second decade of Venera missions, the Soviet Union aimed to conduct experimental missions. The most successful and intriguing launch of this period was Venera 7. As the 11th Soviet probe entered Venus's atmosphere, it became the first spacecraft to transmit data from another planet. The planet's extreme temperatures, thickness, and surface pressures were already documented. Now, the Soviets sought to record Venusian sounds for the first time. The next major success for the program occurred in the early 1980s. Venera 13 surpassed all previous interplanetary explorations in terms of sophistication. This spacecraft was the first to capture color panoramic images of Venus's surface. At the same time, the Soviet program launched Venera 14 to gather similar data about the planet's surface. As one of the first nations to discover and recognize Venus, the Russian Federal Space Agency has revived its ambitions with the Venera missions. Venera D is a planned joint mission between Roscosmos and NASA to explore Venus's atmosphere and surface. The acronym Venera D stands for Venets in Russian, meaning long-lasting. The mission is expected to launch in the late 2020s or early 2030s. It aims to study the planet's atmosphere, climate, geological history, and search for signs of life or past habitability. The spacecraft will include an orbiter, a lander, and possibly a balloon to study the planet's atmosphere in detail. The legacy of the Venera missions extends far beyond their technological achievements and geopolitical implications. These missions, led by the Soviet Union during the peak of the Cold War, represented a pinnacle of human ingenuity and determination in exploring the cosmos. Despite numerous challenges and setbacks, the Soviets persisted in their quest to unlock the mysteries of Venus, a planet long considered inhospitable and hostile to life. One of the most significant aspects of the Venera missions was their pioneering use of robotic probes to study planetary atmospheres and surfaces. These missions set the stage for future exploration beyond Earth's immediate vicinity and laid the groundwork for our understanding of planetary science. The data collected by the Venera spacecraft provided invaluable insights into Venus's extreme environment, including its intense temperatures, crushing atmospheric pressure, and toxic atmosphere dominated by carbon dioxide. Moreover, the technological advancements achieved through the Venera program had broader implications for space exploration as a whole. The development of durable, heat-resistant materials, robust communication systems, and reliable landing techniques were crucial milestones that contributed to subsequent missions to other planets, such as Mars and beyond. The lessons learned from the Venera missions continue to inform spacecraft design and operational strategies in today's space exploration efforts. Beyond their scientific and technological significance, the Venera missions also had profound cultural and political ramifications. At the height of the space race, These missions symbolized the rivalry between superpowers for supremacy in space exploration. For the Soviet Union, achieving success with the Venera missions was not merely about scientific discovery but also about demonstrating technological prowess and ideological superiority over the United States. The international community closely observed each Venera mission, recognizing their importance in expanding humanity's understanding of the solar system. The successful soft landing of Venera 7 on Venus in 1970 marked a significant milestone as the first spacecraft to transmit data from the surface of another planet. This achievement highlighted the Soviet Union's capability to overcome the immense challenges posed by Venus's harsh conditions. In addition to scientific instruments, the Venera spacecraft carried cameras that captured the first close-up images of Venus's surface. These images revealed a rugged terrain characterized by rocky plains and volcanic features, providing scientists with valuable geological insights into the planet's history and evolution. The panoramic photos taken by subsequent missions, such as Venera 13 and 14, further enriched our understanding of Venus's surface morphology and composition. Despite their successes, the Venera missions also faced their share of failures and setbacks. Several missions either failed to reach Venus or encountered technical issues that prevented them from transmitting data back to Earth. The challenges of operating in Venus's hostile environment, including extreme temperatures exceeding 450 degrees Celsius (842 degrees Fahrenheit) and corrosive sulfuric acid clouds, posed significant engineering challenges for spacecraft design and operation. Nevertheless, the perseverance and dedication of the Soviet scientists and engineers involved in the Venera program paved the way for future missions to Venus and other celestial bodies. The legacy of the Venera missions endures in the ongoing exploration of Venus by space agencies worldwide, including NASA's upcoming Venera D mission in collaboration with Roscosmos. Looking ahead, the Venera D mission aims to build upon the achievements of its predecessor by deploying advanced instruments to study Venus's atmosphere, surface geology, and potential signs of past or present habitability. The mission represents a collaborative effort to unravel the remaining mysteries of Earth's closest planetary neighbor and to expand humanity's understanding of the conditions that could support life beyond our own planet.